exciting morning. I love listening to my friends and fellow scholars talk about an artist that I thought I knew pretty well. But I'm seeing so many of these things, particularly when the same painting comes up or the same drawing comes up in multiple talks. I'm seeing them each time through a different lens, and it's not my lens. So it's mind-bending, mind-expanding. Christmas Eve, 1956, when you picked up your issue of Time magazine, you saw Edward Hopper on the cover. Well, this was a singular honor for an artist. Cultural figures rarely hit the cover of Time magazine, but painters, almost never. Well, the writer had caught up with the Hoppers in California, even though just at that moment, a major show of Hopper's works was opening at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This was a big deal, a major solo show at the MFA Boston. But the author continued, rather than attend all the festivities and deal with the press, which was not Hopper's favorite thing to do. The writer said Hopper was hard at work in his usual practice, eyewitnessing America. The writer described Hopper as someone who paints common denominators taken from everyday life, everyday experience. He said through Hopper, Americans discovered the startling truth that a sizable part of our heritage exists in our own backyards. Well, as Erica pointed out last night, Hopper was acutely aware of being an American artist. Even in the 20s, though, I have to say he engaged with many of the same concerns that we discover as we look at the hotel pictures and the relationships in the hospitality services. As Leo has made clear, and his amazing colleagues who contributed to the book, Hopper was intellectually and psychologically absolutely in sync with the realities and the anxieties of contemporary life. In the summer of 1903, this is a big deal, Hopper went to Gloucester, Massachusetts. It was a bustling port, busy town, and an artist colony on roughly 30 miles north of Boston on the coast. Well, it proved to be, I think, one of the key turning points in his life. First of all, he met Joe there. I mean, they'd run across each other, presumably, since both were students of Robert Henry, but they didn't really know each other until the summer of 1923 in Gloucester. Well, according to the stories, they spent a lot of time together wandering around the back streets, quoting French poetry to each other and painting watercolors of the homes of ship captains, maritime merchants, and the Italian immigrants who had come to Gloucester to fish the waters off Cape Ann. Hopper later commented that when other artists were painting ships in the waterfront, which is what you would expect to see in a coastal town with lots of activity on the waterfront, he said, I'd just go around looking at houses. It's a solid-looking town. The roofs are very bold. The cornice is bolder. The influence of ship captains, I guess. In retrospect, it seems clear that for Hopper, these 19th century houses, which he acknowledged more than once as being hideous, symbolized something fundamental about America. It was part of the past that was very much denigrated at the moment. The Victorian era, under the administration of President Garfield, had been corrupt, dishonest. It was not a morally strong part of our history. Anyway, but it prompted Hopper to re-examine the relationships between past and present. Eastern Point Light is probably the first picture that he painted when he got to Gloucester. He wasn't generally an artist in watercolor. He used watercolor for his illustrations, certainly, and he was a great draftsman. But watercolor was something that Joe had suggested that he use. So Eastern Point Light may be the first one that he attempted as an independent artwork. I wanted to show you this because this is obviously a photograph of the lighthouse that was taken 75 years later. One of the points about Hopper's watercolors, which is entirely different from his works in oil, these synthetic compositions for which we've seen dozens of drawings just already this morning, he doesn't work that way in watercolor. He takes a sheet of paper, sort of traces with pencil, small lines, blocks of areas, sort of horizons, clouds, and the verticals, and then fills in with watercolor. So we don't have certainly not this early, not in the 20s, we don't have drawings to tell us what he was thinking or what he was doing. Now, for this particular painting, well, nobody, I think, has said it quite so directly, but Hopper was something of a contrarian. We've heard that he was grouchy, sort of a curmudgeon, but intellectually, he was a contrarian. Instead of painting the conventional view of the lighthouse, he climbed on the ocean side of the rocks so that he was essentially looking back at the bay and the land, not at the ferocious waters and it's hard to get there, I promise you. I ruined a pair of shoes trying to do it. So the waves are crashing around his feet as he's decided to show this backside, really, of Eastern Point Light. It's an on-the-spot picture. It's absolutely literal. So you can see here the only real difference between the scene that he painted and the lighthouse that I took a photograph of in, I don't know, 98 or 99, I think, is that the warning bell is gone. The fog bell that you see over on the left in the watercolor, it had been removed, all of that stuff, by the 90s, long before the 90s was electric or electronic. Well, Hopper was already thinking about gaze. We've seen this in so many of the things that we've already looked at this morning, but gaze and the implications of power relationships that are central to most of his mature work. I love the fact that the hotel management cover from October 1925 shows a group of tourists essentially sitting on an overlook. I mean, this idea of looking down on something, whether it's from the L or from a craggy hillside over a village, allows you to own what you are looking at. I mean, this is something that these people own. Well, take a look at the watercolor. It's a place called Haskell's House that is across the street from the harbor in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The scene that you see here, I mean, it looks like this house is commanding the entire street. It owns Gloucester from this viewpoint. But the thing that I find fascinating is that Hopper had painted the same house, but a year earlier. And when he did it from the side street. So we have this place, I mean, it looks like a, perfectly, comfortable, normal house on a street in Gloucester. But it becomes this dynamic, sort of a palpable character when you look at it from the street below. The mansard roof, which he's emphasizing in the 1924 version of the picture, and the gabled dormer windows, all of these things are distinctly old-fashioned in the 1920s. To get this view, instead of on the side street, Hopper stood across the street, which was downhill. Note the tiny pedestrian. He's done something with scale here. There's this little person that you almost don't notice when you first look at but also notice the telegraph poles. This is a place that we can't go into. We can't, even though we could cross the street and stand by the poles, we have no access to this house. And Hopper makes that clear by framing it and blocking our access with these vertical forms. In the watercolors, as I think you figured out, Hopper is an actual and absolute realist. And what I found fascinating when I went to look at as many of the places that I could locate in his watercolors, that things are still exactly as they were, but I discovered Hopper's, you can figure out where Hopper was standing when he made a particular work, because you stand and you look at something and you look straight ahead and you see what he saw. But if you move 3 feet to the right or left or back a few steps, the view is different. You get different elements and you get a different kind of perspective that gives you a very different thing. So in some ways, Hopper is using his own body as his preliminary sketch in these earlier pieces as he's looking around and framing things. Painting a house with a mansard roof was a risky business for an art in the 20s for an artist who actually wanted to sell some of his work. A New York Times review of his 1924 show, this was his first gallery show, said that Hopper takes, quote, a hideous structure with a mansard roof, flaunting its ugliness on a small hillock that repeats the disagreeable shape of the roof, behind telephone poles, takes none of the shortcuts of the modernists, builds in the splendor of its composition, a new house and a new hill, without losing any of the spirit that built the old. Well, while we're on the subject of disagreeable, laundry hanging out to dry on lines, ramshackle houses painted unconventional colors. These are watercolors that he did in 1923, 1924 in the Italian Quarter in Gloucester. We know that a couple of the pieces are called House in Italian Quarter or just Italian Quarter, but before I had seen those, I discovered Rocks at the Fort, which the fort, it turns out, is an area where Sicilian immigrants came and settled in Gloucester, really in the early years of the 20th century. So, they'd been there for 20 years, 25 years, but we're not talking yet generations of people. So we're not talking second and third generations here. There's something very comfortable, I think, about the women standing there chatting in the backyard, about the man with the dog on the top of the hill. I mean, talk about somebody who kind of owns the place. Well, there was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling in this half-decade. Congress had passed a law in 1921 significantly restricting immigration, particularly of people of what they described as Mediterranean stock. So Hopper, by painting these pictures, is shining a light or focusing a thought about a group of people that he shows as very strong, very much members of the community. And in fact, they were considered, the Italian and also Portuguese immigrants in Gloucester were considered very much members of the productive commercial society. In fact, the press talked about them in terms that usually described pioneers, said they endured hardships, but by perseverance and diligence, they built successful lives for themselves. And they did this work from dories that they rowed out to sea, but they also worked on the beam trawlers. I couldn't resist showing you the difference between what Hopper is doing in the 20s and a Charles Sheeler very modernist picture. Both of them are the decks of ships, but they are very different kinds of ships. What Hopper loves is not the gleaming surfaces that, heaven forbid, a drop of oil should stain. He loves the rusted capstans, the rusted chains. This is where real people work. In the summer of 1927, after a sellout show at his fairly recently joined gallery, the Hoppers bought a used Dodge, so they were now mobile. They could spend that summer on Cape Elizabeth, which is just south of Portland. Cape Elizabeth is beautiful, beautiful. It's right near where Winslow Homer painted all those pictures of Prout's Neck in the 1890s. But the waters are treacherous, especially in the wintertime, and a lot of ships had foundered and gone down. Well, Hopper painted at least 5 versions of the Light at Two Lights. In these two, what fascinates me is that he's not showing us the lighthouse as the beacon of hope, as a symbol of, secure, safe passage. In fact, he's cropped the light beams out of the pictures entirely, instead shows us the backstory. He's showing us the working part of both of these images. He also began connecting images with people whose lives connected them with the sea. This is a painting called Bill Latham's House. Well, Latham was a former schooner captain who had weathered hurricanes. He was one of the local personalities in the lighthouse and shipwreck community. He survived a shipwreck and ultimately had gone to be a Coast Guard surfman, they called them, in the station that was right below his house. Hopper's presentation of Latham's house sets up the same kind of psychological framework we saw in the Haskell House. We are kept from intruding on his space, the private space, by the fence and the tree. Now, for this and for some of his other paintings, there is on the surface, no personal narrative, but there is a palpable human sense. Viewpoint, Hopper uses viewpoint as a device to express a complex dialogue that is happening. Sometimes we're close, sometimes we're distant, but he's always mediating our relationship to what the subject of the picture is. Portland Head Light stands just north of Two Lights. It's the oldest lighthouse in Maine. It was commissioned actually during George Washington's presidency. Well, in the 1920s, when Hopper was along the Maine coast, the Strout family lived in the house and, in fact, were still keepers at the lighthouse. The older senior Strout, Joshua Strout, had gone to sea as an 11-year-old and had risen through the ranks to become a master mariner and ship captain. After he was injured in a fall from the mast of his ship in 1869, he became the keeper at Portland Head Light. Well, Strout was a famous guy in the area. He had lost 3 sons at sea and had barely survived himself. But he was a legend because on Christmas Eve in 1886, he and his son Joseph rescued all 18 people, including the captain and the captain's family, from the Annie C. McGuire when the ship ran aground at the foot of the lighthouse. By the 1920s, there was this great story about the Strout family, these father and son, flinging ropes to desperate crew in a raging snowstorm. And in fact, Joshua, the son, was still lighthouse keeper when the Hoppers came to Cape Cod, but as so often is reality of stories that happen in folklore that we've come to know. It's like, those Norman Rockwell pictures of the gossips, and, the story becomes different with every passing. It turns out, the night that the Annie C. McGuire foundered on the rocks, crashed into the rocks, it was an unseasonable 46 degrees. There was no snowstorm. And apparently visibility was remarkably good. We don't know if they were just celebrating Christmas Eve. But for this, Hopper becomes our liaison with this episode. He becomes the folklorist, if you will, who tells us the story. The houses, too, in contrast to what is happening in a lot of the hotel pictures, are immobile. They're nestled into the landscape. They implied stasis and stability, not movement from place to place. And there's something that is part of the past that was fast disappearing at this point. I have to tell you one other little story. I like to talk in fables. Marty Welsh was another well-known ship captain, but he was a recent hero because in 1920, Nova Scotia challenged the town of Gloucester to a schooner race. Schooners were, fast disappearing as major fishing vessels. Well, but they did it in a way that was designed for Gloucester to lose. There was only 10 days' notice, and it turns out none of the schooners were in port. So none of the good ones anyway. So they were all out at sea. I mean, there was no chance they were going to get back to make this race. But Marty Welsh, who was an enterprising ship captain, he took charge. And just about that time, the Esperanto, which you see here at the upper right, lumbered into view. It was a clunker, I guess, to put it kindly. Anyway, but Marty was an enterprising man, so he enlisted volunteers to make repairs, re-rig, and reballast the Esperanto, and then he took the helm, and the Esperanto sailed the almost 400 miles to the racetrack, the race grounds in Nova Scotia. Well, the race was tight. When the winds picked up, the Esperanto surged forward. When the wind died, the Halifax crew took the lead. And in fact, in the last race, the winds were light. The Halifax crew maneuvered by, if any of you all are sailors, you know what I'm talking about. They got the Esperanto to their leeward side. They were trying to force them to tack away from the rocks, but Marty Welsh and his crew would not do it. At that point, the wind freshened a little bit. They pulled ahead, and they won the first international, I have to get this right, the first International Fisherman's Cup Schooner Championship and a $4,000 prize. Well, it was a dramatic story that, I think of it in terms of the local lore, but the Premier of Nova Scotia, the Mayor of Halifax, as well as Warren G. Harding, who had been elected president the day before. This sailboat race took place in early November. All sent complimentary telegraphs. So here, as with Captain Strout's house and Bill Latham's house, Hopper made a point of telling us who lived in this white cottage. But it's not the distant kind of place that either Strout's or Latham's house are. We're standing here basically looking at it eye to eye, and even though there's a fence and there are also these vertical sort of tree telephone telegraph pole structures, they don't visually keep us out of range. We can go in, we could, if we wanted to, walk up the sidewalk and knock on this guy's door. Well, Hopper's depiction of historical and heroic subjects were not unusual at the moment, although his references to the past are oblique, and he certainly did not intend every New England scene to evoke some sort of historical moment. He was very much a man of his times. He seems to have taken the writings of Van Wyck Brooks very much to heart. Brooks had condemned interpretations of history that celebrated historical figures. So we're talking generals on horseback and, famous men standing there with their arms in their shirts, and instead called for looking at a usable past. He said, if the old ways of understanding American history are inadequate, why don't we just create some new ones of our own? Well, Hopper wasn't, as I said, alone in using American themes to remind us of ordinary people. Thomas Hart Benton was painting the American historical epic just at this moment, which he called a people's history. Charles Sheeler, the guy who did the precisionist beautiful white deck of the ship, was also painting images of Shaker furniture and early American carpeting. Hopper actually included this painting that you see on the left by Birchfield in the article. It's a painting called Civic Improvement. You can see what's happening. They're chopping down trees, taking off the branches. These are old trees, they're tall trees, and they're going to get killed by the process of being pruned so tightly. Hopper included this image by Birchfield in the article that he wrote for the Arts magazine in 1928. One of the things Hopper said is, our native architecture, with its hideous beauty, its fantastic roofs, pseudo-Gothic, French mansard, colonial, mongrel, or whatnot, with eye-searing color or delicate harmonies or faded paint, these appear again and again, as they should in any honest depiction of the American scene. Well, Birchfield's and Benton's paintings are also about loss, and I think by extension and implication, we can legitimately think of some of Hopper's watercolors as about loss, or at least about transitions, where what we know is never going to be the same as what we knew a couple of years ago. He painted the Civil War campground in Maine on the left, but he put telegraph poles there. Erica talked about Cornhill in her talk last night. She showed us the oil. This is the watercolor that you see on the right. And we talked about how Hopper changes things so that what we look at in his oils isn't really what anything looked like. That's what everybody has talked about. And I loved Carter, your drawings and seeing how things evolved. This is a painting that Hopper did in 1933 called Writer's House. It was a house that had been owned by 3 at least generations of family. But take a look at how austere the house looks on the left. It was closed up. It was a house that people used in the summer, closed up for the winter. But you see it's stucco. Well, take a look at the photographs on the right. It wasn't a stucco house, and it wasn't this small, sort of self-contained, arms enclosed cottage. It was very much an expansive home. Beautiful. And also well used, not shutting us out. By the mid-30s, Hopper was increasingly comfortable with naming his house watercolors. His subjects became anonymous. Farmhouse at Essex, house with big pine, things like that. But he did, I wanted to show you sort of as the last closing image, I wanted to show you one of the early watercolors, Mrs. Acorn's Parlor, which was a place that the Hopper stayed for something like 6 or 7 weeks in the 1920s. And hotel interior, or hotel lobby. Mrs. Acorn's parlor is a comfortable place to go. You take a look at what's there. I mean, the white pilaster is a sort of a look-alike for the revolving door on the left of the hotel lobby. But there the differences cease. You sense the presence of people in Mrs. Acorn's parlor. I mean, after all, you can tell where people have been sitting on the chair. Someone has been sitting on the chair. It's comfortable. He's begun to think about the kinds of orthogonals that characterize hotel lobby. This is, almost 20 years later. But we see a Hopper who has changed. This is the Hopper of hotel lobby, could no longer paint something like Mrs. Acorn's car. And what I think is pretty interesting, he also he did paint watercolors later on, but by the mid-30s, they were not a primary medium for him anymore. So when the curator, Catherine Q, asked him if he stopped painting watercolors because he preferred to work slowly, the 2 paintings a year, he said, "I don't think that's the reason I do fewer watercolors. I think it's because the watercolors are done from nature, and I don't work from nature anymore." Thank you.